Good morning, Mrs. Rivers, faculty members, parents, friends, and fellow students of Samuel Fuller School. So, we went to the hospital ward by day, and every night we were singing away. Then the shells and bombs was going again, and the helicopters brought in the wounded men, night after night. These words by the famous musician Johnny Cash provides a picture of the brutality of the conflict in Vietnam. These lyrics create a non-stop cycle of violence and bombs going off and soldiers being carted into hospitals by the thousands. In an era that promoted peace and love, the Vietnam War would be met with arguably the most backlash of any American endeavor. Millions of families would be exposed to the cruel and unforgiving nature of war through the very television screens in their living rooms. My aim is to explain why I believe that the United States did not wage a correct or just war in Vietnam, and why our involvement was completely unnecessary. I will now present what the ancients had labeled as just war. First, the ancient Romans had much to say on the legitimate moral grounds for waging war, which they referred to as casus belli, or cause of war. The Roman Senate had strict views on what they considered to be a just war, typically enemy invasion of a territory or in defense of an ally. In his History of Rome, Titus Livy writes that a commission be at once dispatched to Rome to inform the Senate of our compliance with their demands, and a second to Hannibal, ordering him to withdraw his army from Saguntum, and then surrendering him to the Romans in accordance with the terms of our treaty. Carthage recognized that Rome would consider Hannibal's siege of Saguntum, Rome's ally, as a just cause for war against Carthage. Later, the Roman Senate would consider Caesar's initial response against the Helvetii tribe to be just. In his Gallic Wars, Caesar describes that the Helvetii were attempting to migrate through Roman territory in order to invade another adjacent land. This prompted a legitimate Roman response in which Caesar repulsed the Helvetii back into their own territory. I will now continue with what the medievals thought of just war. War was a massive part of the early and late Middle Ages, as technology and tactics advanced from their ancient counterparts. Two of the most influential medievals of their time, St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, had much to say about war. In City of God, Augustine comments on just war. He says, "But say they, the wise men will wage just wars, as if he would not all rather lament the necessity of just wars, if he remembers that he is a man. For if they were not just, he would not wage them, and would therefore be delivered from all wars." Here Augustine states that wisdom dictates that wars should be waged justly and for just causes, that rather than being waged for money, glory, or one's selfish personal gain. Thomas Aquinas also provides valuable insight on this topic. He writes, "In order for a war to be just, three things are necessary. First, the authority and power to declare and counsel war should be in the hands of those who hold the supreme authority. Secondly, a just cause is required, namely that those who are attacked should be attacked because they deserve it on account of some fault. Thirdly, it is necessary that the belligerents should have a rightful intention, so that they intend the advancement of good and avoidance of evil." In this quotation, Augustine argues that a just war must be declared and waged by the supreme ruler of a nation, and it must have both a just cause and righteous intent behind it. First, only the rightful rulers of a nation should declare war, which in our case, the U.S. Constitution entrusts to Congress. Secondly, there needs to be a just cause for war to be declared, such as the defense of one's nation and interest or of an allied nation. Lastly, a just war requires a righteous intention. For example, a good intention will be the defeat of Nazi Germany and fascist Japan in World War II, while a bad intent will be to exploit or plunder another country's people or interests. Finally, I will address the modern view of just war. As stated above, the framers of the United States Constitution vested Congress with the power, quote, "to declare war, to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be a longer term than 2 years." In order to wage war, the President constitutionally requires a declaration of war by simple majority vote in both houses of Congress. The Constitution also requires Congress to approve any military funding lasting longer than 2 years. Thus, one requirement for American wars to be just, as intended by the Founding Fathers, is therefore to be a legal declaration of war. Moving on, Baron Henry de Jomny, a general of Napoleonic France, wrote much about what constitutes a just war and how it should be waged. It may be doubtful whether a nation has the right to interfere in the internal affairs of another people, but it certainly has a right to oppose it when it propagates disorder which may reach the adjoining states. In other words, Jomny argues that a just cause for war is when another nation may cause potential disorder to neighboring nations. As pertains to Vietnam, the so-called domino theory, which will be discussed later, echoes Jomny's reasoning in this particular area. Most things in life have generally accepted rules, and warfare is certainly no exception. Beginning in 1929 and updated in 1949 after the conclusion of World War II, the Geneva Conventions outline what should and should not be done in modern warfare. For example, the conventions outlaw the use of chemical weapons and painstakingly describe how prisoners of war and civilians are to be treated. They highlight the differences between combatants and non-combatants. Quote, all combatants have to individually distinguish themselves from the civilian population during military operations. Otherwise, they are not entitled to combatant status. Soldiers must clearly distinguish themselves from normal civilians, either by wearing a uniform or other means, in order to limit civilian casualties on or near the battlefield. The Geneva Conventions, even in their earliest forms, have not always been followed. Two examples from World War II are the Japanese treatment of prisoners and non-combatants, as well as the notorious inhumane experiments of Japan's Unit 731. I will now define several key terms that I will use using forward: just warfare, just cause, and just implementation. To start, just warfare can be defined as warfare in which there are, quote, legitimate uses of war, and also moral boundaries on the waging of it. In order for a conflict to be just, there must be valid reasons for it to exist in the first place, such as an invasion of an allied nation, naval blockades, etc. A just cause can be defined as, quote, legitimate self-defense, the correction and punishment of grievous injuries. And war must only be pursued in order to achieve the ends of the just cause without hatred or vengeance, in order to establish a just and lasting peace. Simply put, the goal of just war is to bring peace and preserve the freedom of affected nations. Finally, the International Committee of the Red Cross defines just implementation as the waging of war that seeks to limit the effects of armed conflict by protecting those who are not or no longer taking part in the fighting, and by setting limits on the means and methods of warfare. In other words, non-combatants and their property are off limits, and POWs should be treated humanely and have access to basic living necessities. I will now present my arguments to why I believe the Vietnam War was an unjust war in both its cause and implementation. First, I will address how the war was not prosecuted in a just manner according to the generally accepted rules of war. Rules in war are important to contain, as much as possible, unnecessary death and destruction. Vietnam would not be without its own share of war crimes, and perhaps the most infamous U.S. war crime that occurred ever was the My Lai massacre. In March of 1968, American soldiers were tasked to eliminate Viet Cong forces, which were allegedly hiding out in the nearby civilian village of My Lai. After arriving at the village, however, the American units would discover few, if any, military-aged males. In a truly despicable act, the American soldiers would proceed to kill, torture, and rape inhabitants of the village. This massacre will leave up to 500 Vietnamese civilian deaths, with many more left forever injured and traumatized. The soldiers involved did attempt to cover up and hide their involvement in this deed. The truth only would come to light after Rod Rittenhauer, a helicopter gunner, wrote to several officials detailing what happened. Only one soldier would ever face jail time for his actions, Lieutenant William Cayley, who received a life sentence, however, would be later pardoned and released in '74. Another instance of the United States not implementing the war justly was its use of weather modification techniques, with Operation Popeye. Popeye was a military operation whose objective was to severely reduce the Viet Cong's ability to transport troops and supplies. This was to be done by seeding clouds, which in turn would generate rainfall, with the goal of extending the moonshine season. At first glance, this sounds like an outlandish conspiracy theory. However, Operation Popeye's existence was eventually revealed in the leaked government documents known as the Pentagon Papers. These documents state, quote, continue at present, plus Operation Popeye, to reduce trafficability along infiltration routes. Authorization required to implement operational phase of weather modification previously successfully tested and evaluated in the same area. Thus, these documents allege the existence, successful testing, and the use of weather modification in Vietnam. It has also been reported that the Department of Defense spent upwards of $40 million to create this artificial landfall, making transportation nearly impossible along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a strategic supply line used by North Vietnamese forces. The effects of artificial rainfall, however, were entirely unpredictable. An internal State Department that was eventually released states, quote, "If anything, the tests were too successful. Neither the volume of induced rainfall nor the extent of area affected can be precisely predicted. Because of Operation Popeye and other ecological warfare methods, they would wreak havoc upon civilian farmlands and roads, often deeming them unusable and flooded." In October 1978, after the conclusion of the Vietnam War, the United Nations instituted the Convention on the Prohibition of Military or any other hostile use of environmental modification techniques. All the member states, including America, pledged, quote, "not to engage in any military or any hostile use of environmental modification techniques, which is defined as, quote, the deliberate manipulation of natural processes of the earth, including its atmosphere." In short, the international community recognized the danger of weather modification, and as a result, they banned it. Another piece of evidence that the United States did not implement the war justly is the widespread use of napalm weapons and the defoliant Agent Orange. Napalm is a weaponized mixture of chemicals which creates a highly flammable liquid. Napalm would be used against all sorts of military targets, including troops, buildings, and strategic infrastructure. However, it should be noted that napalm would be highly inaccurate when compared to more conventional bombs, and this more often than not will lead to significant collateral civilian damage. Robert M. Neer, in his book, Napalm, an American Biography, includes an eyewitness account that describes seeing a burnt-out village due to napalm, with pigs eating the remains of burnt civilians. Vietnam was not the first American conflict which saw the use of this weapon, however. In the Korean War, General Douglas MacArthur commented on the devastation caused by this weapon, quote, "After I looked at that wreckage and those thousands of women and children and everything, I vomited." Not only would napalm cause thousands of casualties, it would also result in lasting environmental damage that can still be seen today. Since 1962, American military planes had sprayed roughly 20 million gallons of herbicides in Vietnam. Frequent napalm strikes decimated forests in a matter of minutes, part of a defoliation campaign that had destroyed millions of acres of forests and land crops. The defoliant Agent Orange would also be used in Vietnam to deprive enemy forces of their jungle cover. However, it is well documented that the widespread use of Agent Orange, in addition to deforesting whole areas of Vietnam, would not only cause deformities in Vietnamese children, but would also handicap and kill U.S. troops. To this very day, the people of Vietnam are still affected by infertile farmland, lack of suitable forests, and child deformities, due to the lingering effects of Agent Orange. Continuing on, my next proof that Vietnam was an unjust war lies in the fact that the United States did not have a clear or obtainable victory objective. After the conclusion of World War II, America and the Soviet Union vied with one another in the Cold War. While the Americans were advocates for freedom and democracy, the Soviets pushed for the global spread of communism. This communist push would continue all the way up to the collapse of the Soviet Union. There were multiple occasions when tensions appeared that they would boil over during the Cold War. In 1952, then Senator John F. Kennedy described communism as, quote, "an enemy, powerful, unrelenting, and implacable, who seeks to dominate the world by subversion and conspiracy. All problems are dwarfed by the necessity of the West to maintain against the communists a balance of power." Kennedy clearly believed the spread of communism was a very serious threat to the West and the world. However, as we can see with North Korea and East Berlin, the solution to stopping communism would not be an easy one. The cost of waging a war with the Soviet Union in order to stop the spread of communism would be so incredibly high. At best, it'd be a Pyrrhic victory, at worst, total self-destruction. In the scene of Vietnam, American efforts there did not eventually prevent the country from ultimately falling under communist rule. The next claim that I will be discussing is that the U.S. lost the support of the public. The Vietnam War took place during a high point in technological advancement, leading to the war being the most televised in history at this point. Another major cultural movement in the United States at the time was the counterculture movement, which promoted peace. All of this is to say The majority of the public abhorred violence, yet they were able to see the horrific nature of the Vietnam War from their very living rooms. When the New York Times asked in 1965, "Do you think the U.S. made a mistake sending troops to fight in Vietnam?" 61% of those polled would say, "No, we did not." However, when posed with the same question only 6 years later, a mere 28% would respond with the same answer. These statistics show that the longer the war went on, and the more the public was exposed to its nature, support for the war effort began to drastically fall. This collapse in the public support resulted from both the unjust implementation of the war, as previously stated, but also the lack of clear, obtainable victory objectives that the public could rally behind long term. My final proof for the Vietnam War being unjust lies in the fact that the United States did not have a true or valid reason to enter the war. I will now demonstrate this first by addressing the Gulf of Tonkin incident. As a brief background, 2 U.S. Navy destroyers, the Maddox and the Turner Joy, were deployed to the Gulf of Tonkin in support of the South Vietnamese. On August 2, 1964, the Maddox, while conducting reconnaissance, was engaged by 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats, one of which would be badly damaged by the boat. The Turner Joy would be subsequently ordered to assist the Maddox. Then, on the night of August 4th, the U.S. was led to believe that there would be an imminent attack on both destroyers, and after it was reported that there were several ships approaching, they began to fire. However, contradictory reports eventually came to light, indicating that there was truly no enemy ships in the area that night. A pilot at present, Commander James Stockdale, testified, quote, "I had the best seat in the house to watch that event, and our destroyers were just shooting at phantom targets. There were no PT boats there. There was nothing but black water and American firepower." President Lyndon B. Johnson would use this entire event to heavily ramp up U.S. involvement in the war. Because eyewitness accounts claim that the ship was never attacked, I argue that this presidential action was unjust. The next claim I will discuss is how Congress did not declare war in the traditional sense. As previously stated, Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution gives Congress the sole power to declare war. This is an instance of the separation of powers principle built into our Constitution, and it ensures that the president or military cannot enter into a war of their own accord. And World War II was the last time Congress formally declared war, with every conflict since being informal. Of course, Congress would approve the funding for these conflicts, and it can be argued that the Multiple War Powers Act, starting in 1941, that were passed, and afterwards strengthened, they would strengthen the president's ability to enter into conflicts for a time, before congressional approval is needed. All of that is to say, the United States did not have a formal declaration of war with Vietnam, but because of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, a state of conflict did exist between these 2 nations. I would argue that this is a legal loophole via the War Powers Act of 1941 to enter into a war, and I seriously question the constitutional validity of such actions. I will now begin to address counterarguments against my position on the Vietnam War. I will begin with the well-intentioned but ill-informed domino theory. President Eisenhower would coin this policy principle in a press conference, quote, "Finally, you have broader considerations that might follow what you would call the falling domino principle. You have a row of dominoes set up. You knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is a certainty that it will go over very quickly. So you could have a beginning of a disintegration that would have the most profound influences. In other words, if a country like Vietnam fell under communist control, the nations nearby would likely fall to this as well. In keeping with this principle, the United States adopted a communist containment policy in order to prevent the spread of communism by preventing nations from falling. On a regional level, one can argue that the domino effect did come into play. After Vietnam fell to communism in 1975, both Laos and Cambodia would fall as well, but communism would not expand in Southeast Asia beyond these countries. Even though Vietnam became communist following the withdrawal of U.S. troops, one could perhaps argue that U.S. direct involvement in Vietnam from 1961 to 1975 served to regionally contain the spread of communism. However, this would not be the case globally. Many more communist revolutions would take place around the world. For example, in 1979, the Marxist-Sandinista forces would overthrow the Nicaraguan government and establish a communist regime. Afghanistan would also have a revolution of its own. In 1978, a violent coup would take place that saw the overthrow and execution of then-President Mohammed Daoud. After the smoke cleared, a communist system under the new Democratic Party of Afghanistan would take command and pave the way for eventual Soviet invasion. There are many other examples of both successful and unsuccessful communist revolutions that I can mention, in places such as Africa and South America. In conclusion, I believe that the containment policy based on the domino effect was not a valid reason for the U.S. intervention in Vietnam, and in fact was just a theory. Given the high numbers of communist revolutions around the globe post-Vietnam, and the fact that communism would not spread further in Southeast Asia, it does not follow that the successful prevention of a Viet Cong takeover of Vietnam would ensure that communism would not spread any further. Another counter-argument that I will be addressing is the use of weapons such as napalm and Agent Orange being a necessary evil in order to save more American lives in the long run. The Pentagon Papers seem to argue for this very thing. Quote, interdiction should be carried out to maximize effectiveness and to minimize the political repercussions from the methods used. But different amounts of effort and different political prices may be paid depending on how and where it is done. Critical variables are 1, the types of targets struck, e.g. port facilities involving civilian casualties versus isolated bridges. 2, types of aircraft. 3, kinds of weapons, such as napalm versus ordinary bombs. This quote implicitly acknowledges that the use of such weapons, like napalm, will likely incur a political and civilian cost. Napalm would certainly be effective in rooting out Viet Cong troops and destroying their bunkers. Because of this, many argue that the cruelty inflicted by napalm was a necessary evil. Quote, napalm became a necessary weapon of every modern military force, even though its consequences were among the most inhumane. The effectiveness of the weapon overruled its cruelty. Thus, a cost-benefit analysis is conducted to determine whether the military benefits outweigh the political costs of harming civilians. Given the widespread usage of weapons like napalm and Agent Orange, the perceived military benefits of destroying certain key targets were often determined to outweigh the political costs of destroying civilian property or causing civilian deaths. As I previously stated, minimizing civilian deaths is of the utmost importance in any conflict, and I would argue that the high civilian casualty rate in Vietnam demonstrates that we did not take enough care in avoiding these potential deaths. While I certainly acknowledge napalm's effectiveness against military targets, I view the extensive collateral damage it causes to be problematic. In general, napalm bombs are widely considered to be inaccurate, and so would often cause more harm than good. Nicola Budovanec writes, napalm became a psychological weapon, as the enemy was terrified of the hell on earth caused by its use. Later in the war, the US bombers dropped napalm bombs, which proved to be far more destructive. A napalm bomb could leave an area of 2,500 square yards engulfed in unquenchable fire. Using napalm bombs dropped by a fast-moving aircraft did not guarantee much accuracy. This resulted in many civilian casualties. The inaccuracy of napalm munitions dropped from fast-moving aircraft would often lead to the death of not only combatants, but also civilians. While I do believe in certain circumstances that civilian casualties are sadly inevitable, for example, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the relatively lower stakes of the Vietnam War when compared to World War II, along with the unjust reasons for being there in the first place, make me believe that the use of these weapons was not necessary. In conclusion, I personally believe the Vietnam War was an unjust conflict. The United States entered the war with unclear and arguably unachievable victory objectives. During the war itself, the United States would conduct several operations that would only further blemish its reputation. Operation Popeye and the implementation of harmful weapons such as napalm and Agent Orange would often cause immense collateral damage, both to civilians and even American troops. The nation of Vietnam itself remains scarred and permanently damaged over arguably a meaningless conflict that would see many American soldiers never return home. It is monumentally important that we recognize the errors our country has committed in the past in order that we may not repeat it. That being said, I still have an incredible amount of respect for anyone who served this country and willingly put their lives on the line for us. As the great Union General William Tecumseh Sherman said, war is hell. Thank you.
Thank you for your thesis. I do have one question for you. So, do you think if certain things have been changed during the course of the war, that a solution similar to what we have with Korea could have been achieved with a North Korea, South Korea?
I still personally hold to the fact that no. I think from the very beginning the war was just a doomed effort. I mean, in the first place, we're not fighting in our own land like the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. The Viet Cong knew the jungle extremely well. They put many booby traps. And they would also be able to deploy forces a lot quicker. I mean, despite the technological advancements of planes and ships, it would still take quite a bit to transport new troops from home to Vietnam. I would also argue that a big factor was the South Vietnamese government was pretty corrupt, and that South Vietnamese troops, I would argue, weren't extremely effective, considering after Nixon said told the troops to start withdrawing in '73, we'd see only 2 years later Saigon would fall and the war would end. I would also argue that the public support not being there is also probably the biggest reason to losing the war. I mean, look at the Civil War. Both Lincoln and Robert E. Lee knew that they needed to win a series of victories in order to gain the public support. Because if the war effort has to be upheld by the public absolutely agreeing with it.
Thank you. What do you make of the argument or the idea that the Vietnam War sort of started out with maybe more quantifiable objectives and an understanding of what they were trying to do, and then over time, those objectives broke down, and understanding the conflict broke down, maybe declined throughout the war, and a lot of the negative decisions were made. And there was a documentary made, I think it was with Robert McNamara, called The Fog of War. Just this idea that yes, what you're saying is really valid in theory, but this sort of thing happens in almost any long drawn out war, is that the war strays from the objectives, and the commanders, in a sense, push forward in the face of declining understanding of what's going on in this guerrilla war. Maybe misunderstanding that Vietnam was more of a civil war and a national war of independence from France in some ways, rather than really it's a struggle about communism. I know there's a lot in that question, but it's really just about not American commanders losing touch with having good intentions.
Yes, I definitely agree with that. Honestly, I do think the whole idea of stopping the spread of communism in Southeast Asia is a good idea. But the war lasted around 14 years, and naturally, the amount of, as you said, war is probably the most expensive thing a nation can do. So the amount of resources, money, and dead people that would come from that really this really broke down. I think it broke the public morale, broke the military morale. Like I said, I do not blame most of the soldiers involved. I think they were just doing what they were told, and I don't think they deserve to be spat on when they get home either.
Thank you, Connor, for that. Obviously, a lot of work has gone into this. Good job. If you could just put yourself in the place of a young man back in that period who is watching this unfold, and he's drafted and has to make some decisions about how to respond to that, and particularly assuming this individual is a Christian and trying to think about all this from a Christian point of view, and understands the Scripture's instructions about submitting to and obeying the government and responding to that, and yet also watching what is unfolding and coming to some of the conclusions that you've come to about the unjustness of what's going on. How would you counsel that young man?
The concept of being drafted itself is so just incredibly complicated, and I think really difficult, especially being chose to go to the war by, you're not voluntarily choosing, you're being told by the government, go fight over there, we're going to throw you in jail. I think as a young Christian male, what I would say is, I think you still have to do it. I believe it was Paul, he had to listen to Caesar. Despite the fact that I think the Vietnam War was definitely unjust and we weren't doing good things over there, I think listening to the people in charge is still probably the best move.